Welcome to Dynasty Life. I'm Theo Gremminger. Redraft ends, but Dynasty is life. And we've been dropping some different episodes here on Dynasty Life. We did a rookies only one with Casey Myers of the FF Dynasty. Alan Soslowski came on, and we talked about some players that we anticipate would be overall risers in NFL training camps. And what really in August, we always see a couple guys gain a little bit of value, lose a little bit of value. It's just sort of the nature of the beast. But today, I'm happy to be joined by Ian Miller. Ian has been on Dynasty Life a bunch of times with me, and we continue to bring him back, so he's doing something right. We're going to specifically look at the 2023 class. We're going to look at the second-year players. So I think a lot of attention is going to be obviously on guys like Malik Neighbors, Marvin Harrison Jr., Jaden Daniels, the new players. But in fantasy football, historically, few players gain more than year one to year two. It's just we see it every single year. Last year we started the RB position. There was so many players that became RB2 level players, and of course Bryce Hall gives us RB2 overall. And it's really every year, Ian. We saw it with Devonta Smith a few years back, that massive breakout season from his rookie year to his second year. Quarterback spot, it happens all the time. So really excited to talk about this one. How is your summer going? What are you working on these days, Ian?
Summer's going fantastic, man. Thanks for having me on again. Just got the move from Arizona to Washington, so we're a bit cooler now in the apartment. Not as much heat beaming in here, but yeah, ton of projects this off season. Working to put up a website here in the near future, actually, dynastyim.com. That'll have basically every player we're going to talk about. Has 200 plus players, 200 plus prospects, 100 plus recruits if you're going to get into that level of degeneracy, as a lot of dynasty players do. But yeah, it's been a great summer, man.
They're all going to Ohio State these days, huh? Is that just the way it's going?
Every good receiver.
Every good receiver is an Ohio State Buckeye. It's going to be very interesting. College football right around the corner. You already see like bad clips coming in from some training camps, and the opposing team talks trash. I saw Miami talking trash about Florida. I love it. It's great. And I know you dive into that a lot more. Let everybody know where they can find, your Patreon, what else you're doing. Expand a little bit on the website, because I think people know you from Twitter, Ian, but they should sort of know the work you're providing as well.
Yeah, so the website's basically just going to be what's on the Discord, just all in one easily findable place, which means you can get players' range of outcomes. And I know we're going to talk a lot about that with these second-year guys, is what is the range of outcomes we can expect, projections, players, player tier, prospect tier, their type, where would draft them in a dynasty startup, where would take them versus other players at their position. Every career stat, college stat, even high school stat that they put up will all be on that website. And we'll have a few more fun little wrinkles, like for you to be able to check your rostership. Got a lot of things coming, but yeah, you can find me over my Patreon before we officially launch that.
Yeah, no, awesome. Highly recommend all of Ian's work. And Ian and I are going to be the new co-hosts of Futurecast, which is really sort of an off-season show, but we're going to plan out some really cool stuff throughout the season, dive deep into the 2025 class, get you ready for your Dynasty rookie drafts, maybe talk a little bit about what your rookie picks would be worth this coming year. So anybody who follows Dynasty Life, make sure and look out for Ian and I to drop some Futurecasts. We still don't even have one on the table, but Ian and I probably recorded 3 Futurecasts last year, where you guessed it, with Maddie Keenwom and I, and that's been a show that's always been a strong one for Player Profiler, with Cody Carpentier, Ray Garvin, Maddie Keenwom, myself, and now Ian Miller coming into the fold. So Ian, I'm stoked for that one, man. We're going to be talking 2025 before you know it.
Yeah, could be more excited. I know you talk about how Dynasty is life, and a lot of people lose sight of Dynasty once the season gets started, but we do not.
No, certainly not. And it's like the audience would be sickened if they found out how often I look at my Dynasty rosters. It's just something that, like, Dynasty managers, when you talk to like somebody who grinds Dynasty, it's like you never kind of stop looking at your rosters, even during redraft season when everything is like really short-lived, and I know I have X amount of weeks to make a playoffs, X amount of weeks to make some money. I'm still actively with the Dynasty, and it's just managing all those teams. It's very, very fun though, and you got to love it. But Ian, everybody's getting this question. If you could know the final stats of any single player this season, who would it be? Specifically, let's look at some veterans.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of guys out there who have, even for veterans, a pretty high range of outcomes. And I think that there's a lot of different players you could choose, but there's one that we're probably going to look deeper into, and he's not as much of a veteran, but Devon Achane.
There you
Because
go.
when you look at his final stats, there's not really, I would say, too many outcomes where you're looking at, because his range of outcomes is so exciting. So when you talk about Devon Achane and you get his final stats, you're either looking at someone who absolutely killed ADP or was a little bit of a disappointment at ADP. There's not too much where you look at Devon Achane's range of outcomes, look at his ADP and say, he'll probably hit right exactly where he's going to be. He's one where the floor isn't as great as others around him, but the upside around him is just fantastic. And if you can know the final stats of that, and you know that he hits to a very high degree, which is what he has a chance to do, then he's someone you'd be drafting in essentially every draft where he's going. So I know he's someone we're going to dive more into, but he's one where if I can know any stats, he's got to be the guy.
Well, let's just finish out the Devon Achane conversation right here. Devon Achane finishes as RB what this season? Though I can give you like a ranges here if you prefer, Ian, or you can tell us top 6, top 9, top 12, top 15.
Yeah, we have, or I have his projection, his median outcome right now at 16.6 points per game, which would be RB8. But the thing that you don't see too much with running backs that have that level of median is we're talking about a ceiling points per game of 23.5 points per game. The only others with a higher ceiling is Christian McCaffrey, Bijan Robinson, Breece Hall, and Jonathan Taylor.
I absolutely agree with you. And this is sort of like, I have this conversation with Billy Muzio a lot, is projections do not necessarily indicate where the player is going to finish, because you also don't even like really factor in the timing of the spike weeks too, Ian, where you bring up a guy who could average 23 points per game, you have him averaging 16 for the season, means this guy can put up 30 burgers when the game's on the line. So if you catch that sort of fire with a player like him, there are certain running backs who we probably both like that we think there's no chance that could give us a 30-point week in week 17, week 16. With Devon Achane, it's like he could do it on 4 touches. So for me, it's the guy has been one of the priority targets of mine. His ADP is starting to rise a little bit in certain formats. You're starting to see a lot more second round Devon Achane. A couple months ago, it was a lot more third round Devon Achane. On Underdog, you're still able to get him a lot of times in the third round. Excuse me, an incredibly exciting player and a great segue to today's show because we have so many exciting players in this class. The second year players, if you just have to look at ADP right now, are dominant. But before we do that, how about a rookie, Ian? And you could probably give me 10 guys that you want to know the final stats for, but one that's really like pressing on your mind right now for the final stats this year.
Yeah, I think if I could know one rookie, and this would be 2 birds with 1 stone, it's got to be Blake Corum. Because if I know what Blake Corum does this season, I also probably have a good chance of knowing what Kyren Williams does this season. And both are guys that can absolutely win you your league. But Blake Corum, of course, is the guy who's going much later. And he also has a solid chance, a fine chance, I would say, of being a very high-end contributor and fantasy producer right away in a Sean McVay offense, being a high-end backfield, especially knowing Kyren Williams' injury status or injury history that he comes with from last season and time in college. And if I know Blake Corum's final stats, he's also someone who can win me leagues based on his ADP.
Yeah, I love it. And I would say that Matt Kelly, the Podfather, and Ian are probably the 2 highest like Blake Corum fans out there right now, especially on our neck of the woods at Player Profiler. Blake Corum's a guy that we have pretty high up in our dynasty rankings versus consensus, like, some of our competitors. Ian, right about where would you value Blake Corum in dynasty running backs? And I know you don't have to give us the exact range, but he's a top what running back for you at this point?
Yeah, I can give you an exact one because I have Blake Corum right now as about RB25, RB26 range. Someone who's probably a pretty good option in the 9th, 10th rounds of your dynasty startup. Because if he is someone who comes through with a McVay offense, even if it takes a Kyren Williams injury in front of him, we know that Sean McVay deploys bell cow running backs. We know that Blake Corum has handled and been fine with a bell cow running back role and has been a fine receiver out of the backfield in the past at Michigan. So he's someone who, yes, you draft him in the 9th, 10th round, and you already talk about guys who have shaky floors. He's one of those guys who can absolutely give you a much needed value boost going into 2025 with a great season, or if you got him in the 10th round, you're looking pretty solid.
Yeah, that's the thing. If Blake Corum takes over in the second half of the season, and let's say Kyron Williams breaks down a little bit, then you're going to see Blake Corum in dynasty startups a year from now be a guy that just explodes in value. Talk about ninth round right now. He'll be a guy that's going in like the third or fourth round in single QB leagues, just based on the strength of the McVay offense, the draft capital they put in Corum, and his ability to handle volume, I think, is underrated as well. He's a guy who could be a bell cow in this offense. So really, really fun one. We're going to take a short break. And when we come back, we're diving into second-year players. We're going to talk about a couple players at the top, but I really want to focus in on some of these players in the big range of outcomes, guys who can make or break your fantasy season. We'll be right back.
Hey, why do we partner with the FFPC? Because they have the widest variety of fantasy football formats, and it's the easiest place to find all types of fantasy football contests in the world. What if you want to play for high stakes? Well, they have a $6 million prize pool with their Fantasy Players Championship. They also have way too early best ball leagues that start in February and dynasty leagues. They have the closest thing to a liquid market for orphans that there is in all of Dynasty. And the FFPC has sponsored us for half a decade because we are actually delivering information that can help fantasy gamers, and they're generating so much interest into bringing in so many new users, casual users even. The FFPC creates a unique experience where you can both compete against the best and make money. Use promo code UNDERWORLD to get $25 off your first team. $25 off your first team at the FFPC with promo code UNDERWORLD. Go get it!
Welcome back to Dynasty Life. Theo Gremminger with Ian Miller. Ian, let's just get after it right now. We're talking about these second-year players, and we briefly touched on Devon Achane. I'm going to ignore Jahmyr Gibbs. I'm going to ignore Bijan Robinson. I'm going to ignore Puka Nacua, even though Puka has a slight little knee injury. It sounds like it's nothing serious. So I'm going to ignore some of these guys towards the top. But I do want to touch on quarterbacks and tight ends. Let's talk about CJ Stroud or Anthony Richardson. Which player is going to score more fantasy points this year? They're side by side on Underdog, and in most 4-point passing touchdown formats, they're side by side. In certain 6-point passing touchdown formats, like maybe NFFC, CJ Stroud's going a little bit ahead, but these guys essentially are in the same tier. And that matters because this year matters in Dynasty. We're not playing Dynasty Theory where we're looking, how well we did over the next 6 years. We want to win money this year. Where are you at, Ian, on CJ Stroud versus Anthony Richardson this season?
Yeah, I love this question because it's one of the very few times where redraft ADP and dynasty ADP, or your perspective on a player, is allowed to shift a bit. Most of the time, a lot of redraft actually finds its way into dynasty because that immediate season matters so much. But Anthony Richardson is one where I feel different in dynasty than I do in redraft, because when you're playing redraft, you're looking for that 1 year. Peripherals aside, you just want high-end production. And that's something Anthony Richardson will have a chance to do, even if he's a really bad passer. Something that we don't know and is more likely than not, based on his college resume and the brief stint we saw as a rookie, it's hard to project someone being a good passer, let alone someone that we've never seen be a legitimate passer when we look at the peripherals. The reason I bring that up is because let's talk about the dynasty and redraft difference just a couple years ago between Justin Fields. Justin Fields was a fine pick where he was because while his passing peripherals were not great, he's someone who still posted a 21 point per game season for you in redraft. But in Dynasty, he was a first round pick. And despite having a good season, at least from a production perspective, a lot of that came from rushing. And if we know anything about real life NFL, you can't just be a rushing quarterback that doesn't have good passing peripherals attached. And that's the one where Justin Fields was a shaky pick, even though you can project for solid points per game in Dynasty because he was a first round pick. You want guys with very high floors when you're investing that kind of asset or value into them, and not being a fine or like projectable good passer at this point is very hard to stick your teeth in when you're talking about first round Dynasty startup ADP And clearly that didn't work out for Justin Fields, but it did in redraft. And that's where Anthony Richardson comes into the fold. Because in Dynasty, he's a fringe first round startup guy. And for someone who, we can project to have very high rushing production, he's someone who doesn't have the passing floor that you'd like to see from a longevity standpoint or even near future standpoint in the Dynasty market. So the Dynasty ADP is not great. But in redraft, yes, he's going higher in redraft. You're talking about QB6 on underdog. That's a fine price because we know even if he's not a good passer, he's still someone who's going to put up a 20-point per game season, assuming that he has health on his side. And if he does hit as a passer, you're looking at possible QB1 type overall. In Dynasty, that's harder to bet on because you're spending more and you don't have as much of a longevity floor. With Anthony Richardson in redraft, we're not as much worried about that longevity floor. So I totally get taking Anthony Richardson above CJ Stroud in redraft. And it's one of the few times where I think Dynasty and redraft kind of are on opposite ends here because most of the time they line up. CJ Stroud in Dynasty, absolutely. You have a high floor. For a passer, you have a path to a top 5 season, even without high-end rushing. With Anthony Richardson, you do have that, but you don't have the floor. You don't have the high-end passing floor that you need to invest such value in him. And in redraft, that does not matter. So I'm perfectly fine in redraft taking someone like Anthony Richardson, who has the higher ceiling in the next coming year and a high floor for the individual year next year.
Yeah, so Richard, I completely agree with you. In Dynasty, it's Stroud. It has to be Stroud. Stroud is in the mix for QB1 overall in Dynasty based on what we saw last year, based on what the team has done for him. Upgrading from Robert Woods to Stephon Diggs is crazy. And also, we have a year 2 coordinator. We have pass catchers that we've seen succeed with him. I mean, everything's sort of checking off for CJ Stroud. For this year specifically, though, I agree with you. Anthony Richardson, like we saw Jalen Hurts, we saw Josh Allen give us 15 rushing touchdowns each. Richardson has that in the range of outcomes. I think they're both fine, though, this year for draft-wise, because you're able to pass on like the top 4 quarterbacks and then still get exceptional value. Stroud, maybe I would say, has less of a ceiling, though. So for me, if you're looking for a ceiling outcome at the quarterback spot, it's Richardson. That simply is because I agree with you. It's the rushing production. Even if CJ Stroud doubles his rushing production from last year, he's still not going to be a guy that makes a huge impact with that. So for me, it's Richardson in redraft, but CJ Stroud is fine as well. I just need to kind of manage where I think these guys will finish. I think CJ Stroud gives us a top 5 potential finish. Richardson, if it all goes well, talking about like 15 rushing touchdowns like we saw with Jalen Hurts, like we saw with Josh Allen last year, and 800 plus rushing yards. I think that's also in the range of outcomes. How about the tight end spot? We have a sort of a revolution at the tight end spot when it comes to youth. Guys we're not even talking about today, like Kyle Pitts in year 4, Trey McBride in year 3. But let's specifically look at Sam Laporta and Dalton Kincaid. And I'll break this question up. Is Sam Laporta going to finish as tight end 1 overall again? And if not, where does he finish among all tight ends?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair question because we saw Laporta put up the most points a rookie tight end has ever put up. And he did it with very strong peripherals. And he goes into another season with Ben Johnson at the helm, likely very high passing attempt offense. And essentially, he has what he had last year in terms of his surrounding situation. And he goes to year 2 where we expect growth from a peripheral standpoint. So Laporta is someone who I would be taking over Kincaid pretty comfortably because we've already seen it. With Kincaid, we've seen flashes, we've seen fine peripherals, but his range of outcomes has a much less friendly floor because of the fact that it wasn't a super fantastic prospect profile, and we don't have a super fantastic prospect profile, and you match that with a solid rookie season, you still don't have the floor that you do with Laporta, where he was a similar prospect, but he showed us he's one of the best rookie tight ends we've ever seen, and from a peripheral standpoint and production standpoint. So Laporta is someone who you can pretty reasonably expect to be in that top 3 tight end mix, even tight end 1 finish, whereas Kincaid, you're relying on a situation, which is part of the reason he's propped up so much, is he's in a Buffalo offense. He's in a Buffalo offense where they don't have Stephon Diggs anymore. They don't have Gabe Davis anymore. They brought in a rookie wide receiver with an okay prospect profile. And so you're looking at the situation, but you're not 100% sure that he's someone who can have the peripherals that we expect from Sam Laporta. So in terms of that, I don't think Kincaid's a bad pick at ADP, but if I'm picking between the two, Laporta is someone we can expect to be a top 3 tight end, whereas Kincaid is someone we hope to be a top 3 tight end.
So I like them both a lot at ADP, but it's a big gap at this point where Laporta, it's actually kind of funny because this is going to be the lowest drafted for a tight end 1 overall in several years. You have to go back multiple seasons where the market was not pushing one of these guys way up. You talk about Travis Kelce, you talk about Mark Andrews. Like on Underdog, Laporta is a 3rd-round pick. In NFFC, you can get Laporta like the 3-4 turn. FFPC, Laporta is a 2nd-round pick, where we've always seen the tight end 1 going in like the last year Travis Kelce top 5, and in some leagues top 2. So it's interesting. Laporta is going to crush, and I love what you brought up with the peripherals. But like a lot of people think of Laporta as just this massive spike week guy, this big touchdown guy. But 125 targets his rookie season is elite for the tight end position. Kincaid, to me, though, I think we're getting a little bit of an opportunity with this Dawson Knox talk. We've seen Dawson Knox in the league forever, and we've also seen, like you said, the wide receivers in Buffalo. There's not a guy there where we're like, that guy's going to get 130 targets. Like Curtis Samuel, Keon Coleman, I just don't see it. So for me, Kincaid, anytime he's on the field, he's a threat to be targeted and featured. This is a guy where I think he's going to perform well. But again, I think they're both fine. And I hate to not be negative on any of these. We talked about the top 2 quarterbacks, top 2 tight ends. I can't be negative on any because they're all really, really good players. But let's talk about some players where we're going to have a little hesitation. 2 guys that didn't make the 10 players I want to talk about. Quick thoughts on Luke Musgrave and Zach Charbonnet. Do either one of these guys appeal to you maybe a little bit more? Are you apprehensive about them? I sort of lump them together because Musgrave's hanging out in that mid tight end 2 range where guys could go all over the place. Saw last year that was a Chigakonkwo level draft pick. And then Charbonnet's a guy where I expected a little bit more of a market for him. All the positivity out of Seattle has geared towards Ken Walker, but this is a 2nd-round pick. We talked about second round pick last year's draft. We talked about 2nd-year backs oftentimes taking a step further. We believe that the pace of play in your neck of the woods in Seattle area is going to be a lot faster, a lot more plays run. I think there should be a little more buzz for Charbonnet, but curious your thoughts on these 2 guys, Ian.
Yeah, in terms of now, for running backs, so Zach Charbonnet, when I get a running back, especially a young one, a 2nd-year running back, I'm never going to be fully out because while we expect Kenneth Walker to have essentially a bell cow level role, as we've seen from the backfield with his carry percentage, and that kind of leaves Charbonnet being the odd man out, it just takes one injury for all running backs, especially the one immediately behind them in the depth chart, to start getting a run at things. But the issue that I have with selecting Zach Charbonnet is where he's getting selected, because he's in the range where you can get someone like an Alvin Kamara, and you don't have to hope that there's an injury in front of him. Alvin Kamara is someone more so you're just hoping doesn't get injured because we can expect high-end production even at his age. And then there's other players around his ADP in Dynasty where you can expect production. With Zach Charbonnet, you're hoping that there is the injury in front of him. And for that alone, I'd say his range of outcomes has very much floor of non-meaningful production attached. His range of outcomes, actually, when we put it through the model, is one of the largest range of outcomes we have for any running back right now. But a majority of it are players that didn't produce even running back 2 seasons. So we don't have a whole lot to go on with Charbonnet. He didn't have a fantastic profile. We're hoping for that injury in front of him. And if he was a bit cheaper, I would have more Charbonnet. But the fact that he's in the same range as guys that we talked about, like Alvin Kamara, like Najee Harris, where you can expect production without an injury in front of them, and you don't have to worry or hope that they turn their peripherals into something that we can latch on to.
I will say one thing about Charbonnet that it gives me a little bit of Mondre Stevenson vibes in the fact that he has a bigger frame with the ability to catch passes. That sort of profile always intrigues me for fantasy. I agree that there is, from a dynasty perspective, if we're talking about a startup value right now, there are other guys that are going to give me that guaranteed production. But in terms of contingent upside, I think Charbonnet is really interesting and in this offense. And last year, he had more receptions than Ken Walker, and he also ran for more yards per carry than Ken Walker. So Ken Walker is obviously a very talented guy. He's a guy where he's got the home run hitting ability. Definitely an interesting one to kind of keep an eye on. How about Luke Musgrave? Any hope for him? Ian, we talk all about the Green Bay wide receivers at length because it's a place where there's a little bit of indecision in the dynasty marketplace as well as the redraft marketplace. But Musgrave, we have no Tucker Kraft. He's been banged up. Musgrave seems like a guy who could be a year two riser, where we look back a year from now and we say Musgrave took a big step forward. Do you share that enthusiasm, or do you think he's more of a sporadic spike week type athletic tight end where there's a lot of more consistent touches at the wide receiver and running back spot in Green Bay?
Yeah, I think that if you said pick one team to know their final stats, it has to be the Green Bay Packers, because the Green Bay Packers, you could be all over the board. And I've seen many very sharp analysts be all over the board on basically every asset within this Green Bay offense, because the Green Bay offense is very unique in the sense that we have Jordan Love going into just his second year as a starter. So there's already a bit higher range of outcomes despite a very good year one. Then they bring in a running back, not just a rookie running back, but that alone has high range of outcomes. They bring in Josh Jacobs, and bring in someone in like that. You usually get a high range of outcomes for a veteran running back when they switch teams. But then the most important part and the hardest part to project is all the receiving options, because you have Romeo Doubs going into year 3. You have Christian Watson going into year 3, and he's been banged up, so you haven't seen a full healthy season from him. Then you talk about Dontavian Wicks having plenty of upside going into year 2. Jaden Reed having plenty of upside going into year 2. Tucker Kraft going into year 2. Luke Musgrave going into year 2. And when you talk about players who aren't bona fide studs or high-end peripherals in year 1, you have a pretty large range of outcomes for players going into year 2 under that circumstance. And Green Bay Packers essentially have all of them. So we're looking at a lot of guys who are contingent off of each other in this receiving game, and they all have a high range of outcomes. There's not one right now that you could just say, all right, well, this is the alpha. The rest will eat what's left, and we'll figure out what's left. The whole pie is open. So with Luke Musgrave, there is upside. Even with Tucker Kraft, there is upside. And with Luke Musgrave, we've seen it. He was drafted before day 3, so he has a fine prospect profile for a tight end prospect. And he had a fine rookie year. He had spurts of a pretty high target share on certain weeks on a rather large average depth of target, which for tight ends usually is a pretty good sign that you're getting high leverage targets, which is what matters, especially if Jordan Love continues to ascend or even just reproduces what he did last year towards the end of the season, especially as a passer. So there is upside with Luke Musgrave, and he's someone that you're fine taking at his ADP. But again, he's someone that has a large range of outcomes on an offense that has a large range of outcomes.
Yeah, I think you sort of nailed it. But for me, I'll take some shots on Musgrave in all formats this year. This was a guy where second round draft pick, a very plus level athlete, and a guy where we sort of felt like a spike week was coming early last year. Then sort of injuries derailed him. We saw a lot of Tucker Kraft towards the end of the year. But there was a number of weeks where he had a lot of air yards for a tight end, and they were willing to take shots on him. I'm curious to see the wrinkles in year 2. Musgrave could be a guy where he could be a big beneficiary of touchdowns in this offense, because we don't like Christian Watson, Jaden Reed, like we sort of know what these guys are, but I think there's still a lot of development in that wide receiver room. So agreed, Musgrave is a guy where I want some exposure to, but I'm not telling you to go out and just draft him every draft, but I don't want to be without Luke Musgrave. Let's talk about the key players on this list. So I have 10 names here, and we're going to rip through some of these ones. Will Levis or Bryce Young. Both of these guys are being drafted as QB2s or lower in redraft. In Dynasty, these are guys you're getting at a discount. Neither one is going to cost you a ton in Dynasty startups. It's very notable that Bryce Young actually lost a lot of value from last year in his startup price. Carolina and Tennessee have both gone out and added weapons. Carolina gets Deontay Johnson. Carolina drafts Xavier Legette. They draft JT Sanders. They draft Jonathan Brooks, a guy who can catch balls out of the backfield. And then Will Levis, they sign all these old guys. They get Calvin Ridley, Tony Pollard, Tyler Boyd, and of course DeAndre Hopkins is back, Tyjae Spears. So, and Callahan, the head coach. So it's a philosophical change. Who scores more points this year? Who do you want on your dynasty rosters?
Yeah, this is almost another one where it's not as much separation as we talked about, but dynasty and redraft can alter a little bit in how we're feeling about them, because Bryce Young is someone that was pretty bad last year, especially when you compare to all rookies, especially first round picks. Or first overall picks. He was quite bad. But the thing with Bryce Young, why he will stay afloat and he's a fine pick, isn't because we'll think he'll explode this year. He's someone who doesn't rush a lot and had poor passing peripherals, although they did add someone like a Deontay Johnson and Xavier Legette. So they're trying to put these weapons around him, and they have Dave Canales now going in there. So there is upside for Bryce Young, but it's not as high as someone like Will Levis. Now, the thing with Will Levis is I thought this was an awesome comparison, and shout out David on Twitter, because he said Will Levis reminds him of Jameis Winston, and I think that's exactly on the money. And part of the reason that you can like Will Levis, and in leagues where interceptions don't matter or is not as much of a negative as maybe standard -2, you should love Will Levis essentially, because he's going in, they added weapons. Hopefully DeAndre Hopkins can stay healthy. But with Will Levis, we're talking about someone who his big time throw rate was 5.9% amongst the whole league, not just rookies last year, that only trailed Geno Smith, Matthew Stafford, Tua, Josh Allen, Dak Prescott, and Tyrod Taylor. But the Jameis Winston part comes in because you have a guy who can make these awesome throws, get you a ton of points on big time throws. And yet when we talk about his turnover worthy percentage of 4.5%, the only quarterbacks that was better than last season was Nick Mullins, Tyson Bagent, Mac Jones, Taylor Heineke, and Desmond Ridder. So we have polar opposite things going on with Will Levis, who doesn't have the floor or stability that Bryce Young does as a number one pick. So for this year alone, give me Will Levis, because we've seen him throw big time throws. He adds a Calvin Ridley to the offense. He adds possibly a offense that goes from second to last in pass attempts to one that we've heard rumors of being one of the higher flying offenses in terms of passing volume, which could be great for Will Levis, who loves to chuck the rock. Bryce Young is someone who we're a bit shaky on, but even with a bad year or just a slight improvement from Bryce Young, while it'll be meaningful production, he's someone that likely holds or just drops a bit in value, because number one overall picks will always, always, always continue to get chances. And you could be looking at someone like Bryce Young in terms of range of outcomes. You're either looking at Matthew Stafford from poor year one to great year two jump as a number one overall pick, or you're looking at someone like Sam Bradford, who is just okay, which is what we can expect from Bryce Young, but he holds a job down for a very long time, giving him lots of chances to just hold value. So in Dynasty, the safe pick is Bryce Young. But if you're looking for a chance at meaningful production, I'd say you have a slightly higher chance with someone like Will Levis, but you have to understand that the floor just isn't as high.
I'm not crazy about either one of these guys. Bryce Young last year, for all quarterbacks over 500 pass attempts, was beyond dead last in completion percentage. He was like 59%. They did sign the offensive lineman, interior linemen, which I think are going to help Bryce Young a lot. Deontay Johnson, I think, helps him a lot. Tennessee, it's interesting because the weapons are old, and they are projected. Both of these teams are projected to not score a lot of points when you're talking about pretty much any projection. Stylistically, I think Tennessee is going to try to get in a little bit more shootout mentality. I'm not really crazy about either. I'm willing to be wrong on both. I've mixed up sort of exposure to both of these guys. Will Levis has been a guy where I've taken him in a couple of startups as like a QB3 just in case. I think he could gain a lot of value. Bryce Young worries me, but I do think with Dave Canales, you're spot on where if he's going to produce, it's with Canales. I wouldn't advocate making either one of these guys the focus of your draft plan. I could go either way on this one, Ian. I think I'll defer to you on this one. Let's talk about some more exciting players, though. I want to get your opinion here on Rashee Rice. Rashee Rice is a guy where it's interesting because if there were not the off-field problems, people would have had to pay a lot more in Dynasty Startup ADP, in Redraft ADP, and Best Ball ADP. You're starting to see Rashee Rice creep up in Redraft and Best Ball ADP, though, because the off-field incident, nothing looks like it's happening from it. So all the worries that Rashee Rice was going to be this guy who's serving a huge suspension, looks like he's probably going to be there on day one. But we have wide receiver target competition now with Xavier Worthy, who I know we're both big fans of, and also Hollywood Brown, a guy who's by all accounts having a really strong start to camp and has been a guy who's had success in his career. Your thoughts on Rashee Rice this year and also his dynasty stock?
Yeah, Rashee Rice is someone that you should like, and the dynasty community actually really liked. He had very good peripherals. He had solid spike weeks, and you talked about those options, none of them being a true alpha target hog, and someone they were talking about being a 25% plus target share earner. Because Xavier Worthy, as good as we think he is, he's still going to be a rookie, and not quite the rookie is of like Malik Neighbors, where 25% target share is well within the range of outcomes. So he's not going to be someone that's stealing lunch money from other receivers. Marquise Brown, we essentially know who he is at this point in his career, and he is a fine target earner, being like a 20 to 22% kind of guy. And Travis Kelce, especially as of late, is kind of in that same boat until we got to the playoffs, essentially, where he started earning a majority of the targets. But Travis Kelce is a year older, and last year we saw his target share be one of those 22% guys, not a high-end alpha earner. And in a Patrick Mahomes offense, we know this ball can get spread around. And the other thing with Rashee Rice is that he is someone that has a fine range of outcomes to hitting that 25% target share. In fact, when we look at what he did on a per route basis, he was a 25% plus target rate guy. And his yards per out run were above 2.25 yards per out run, which is great. So he's efficient and earned a lot of targets when he was specifically just on the field. And if we look at all rookies to do that on 200 plus routes, all have at least a wide receiver 2 season, and all of them except one have a wide receiver 1 season to their name. The only one that didn't was Chris Olave, who we can still expect to do that at some point. Rashee Rice is the next member of that group and someone we should expect to have that production. And the dynasty community did, because following the season, his keep trade cut value was at wide receiver 21. He was a top 25 wide receiver. Then the first incident happens, wide receiver 30. Second incident happens, wide receiver 51. And this is where I was basically advocating from the top of a mountaintop to go and buy Rashee Rice. And guess what? Just from him not doing anything, suspension kind of being forgotten about, or a big unknown still, and we're about to the season, just from time happening and people getting back on board with his profile, he's now back up to wide receiver 32. So you've made gains from him not doing anything. And he's still cheaper than he was when we ended the season, and people were just specifically looking at what he did in a Patrick Mahomes level offense. And we should be looking at that again without the extra thing. And he's still kind of a discount. And on a Mahomes offense where he can throw 50 plus touchdowns and throw for basically league records from a passing yards perspective, Rashee Rice is still a fantastic guy on the market, even despite the recent increase in his value.
I agree with you. And last time you were on Dynasty Life, we talked about guys who were going to gain value, and you were absolutely correct. You picked Rashee Rice as one of them. To me, Rashee Rice, it's sort of a bigger argument in Dynasty, because when you look at replacing Travis Kelce, everybody's looking at replacing Travis Kelce. You don't really do that necessarily with a tight end. When you think about his impact on the overall offense, Travis Kelce as the first down maker in this offense, the guy that Mahomes looks at as the safety blanket. Certainly, Xavier Worthy is going to be schemed into usage. We believe in him. But with me, Rashee Rice in 2025 could be the guy who's like seeing a huge target gains, as we see Travis Kelce maybe take a step backwards as he gains a little bit of age, if he's ever going to lose anything. But for me, Rashee Rice this year is a value. Long-term is a value based on what we actually saw in the field last year. And Ian, his size and skill set do not overlap with Xavier Worthy and Hollywood Brown. You could see Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy slight overlapping this year on some of the ways they use them. Rashee Rice is sort of out there on his own, on an island in his role on this team. So I'm an advocate of drafting Rashee Rice and also trying to pick up some. I think this is actually a nice window to still trade for him while the market still is a bit confused as to what to do with him. Another player who's confusing to a lot that I've been bullish on is Zay Flowers. Zay Flowers last year had a very strong rookie year, broke the Ravens record for receptions by a rookie. Had very strong numbers in terms of yak and separation. First round draft capital, and Baltimore wide receiver 2 is a big kind of question mark. There's this Rashad Bateman buzz, which I don't really buy into. We've sort of seen it. Zay Flowers to me is a value, but there's some people that push back on that, and they're a little bit hesitant for his potential scoring in 2024 and beyond. Where are you at on Zay Flowers?
I think Zay Flowers is someone who's a fine asset to have. He's currently being valued at wide receiver 22, so people know that he's good. My only issue with not having a high exposure to Zay Flowers is that from his passing, or not his passing production, his production alone, he's someone that you know is going to be good, but where is the ceiling is essentially the question. Because when we look at his range of outcomes, essentially every name in his range of outcomes is someone who we've seen put up a wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 level season, but it gets a bit thinner and more of a question mark when we're talking about wide receiver 1 level success. And my opinion going in is if you're going to buy someone in top 25 wide receiver, I would rather be wrong, but shoot for the upside than have someone who you draft there and is consistently a wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3.
I'm going to pause you. I'm going to go OTC. We're talking about a trade or a dynasty startup pick. Brian Thomas Jr. or Zay Flowers. Which way are you going?
I'll still take Zay Flowers because Brian Thomas Jr., I'm not sure that his upside or ceiling is as good.
Let me curveball it to you. We're going to rapid fire these. Lad McConkey or Zay Flowers?
I'll still go Zay Flowers.
Keon Coleman or Zay Flowers?
Still Zay Flowers.
Okay, so we're already there. Okay, here's one. Xavier Worthy or Zay Flowers?
I think, this is tough. I think I might go Xavier Worthy, but the nice part is you don't technically have to right now. But I think if they were both about even value, I would lean or at least have at least half exposure if I did a draft 10 times and chose between them. Xavier Worthy, I'm taking at least 5 times in a perfect world. So that's essentially where I'm at. And the nice thing is when we look at wide receiver ranks on Keep Trade Cut, Xavier Worthy is still about 8 wide receiver spots behind Zay Flowers. So you can get a guy that you probably want a little bit more because you're shooting for that upside that with maybe a little less floor for 8 wide receivers in value later. So that's essentially where I'm at.
Yeah. So for me, I actually think Flowers is going to gain some value this month in training camp because we keep hearing like a lot of the steady drum beats out of Baltimore with Isaiah Likely and his involvement in the offense, how they're going to play 2 tight ends. Isaiah Likely has potential to be the number 3 target on this team. To me, that's a testament to the overall quality of the wide receiver position. I also think sort of the X factor, Ian, to everything is Todd Monken. Where people think they have a handle of what the Todd Monken offense is, we don't know. And also the threat of play action with Derrick Henry this year is going to be stronger than potentially in the past where you had all these running backs who were not necessarily like J.K. Dobbins healthy, of course, had his moments, but there's been a lot of guys kind of playing next to Lamar Jackson that don't necessarily scare you if you're an opposing defensive coordinator. I'm going to take a bullish approach on Zay Flowers. I think we'll see it this month. We've seen his ADP creep up a little bit on like FFPC and FFC for redraft. And in Dynasty, he's a guy where I kind of agree with you with all those rookies. And I do think that there's a market there, Ian, where you can trade a Lad McConkey and you can get a Zay Flowers. If you agree with Ian on that one, I think that trade is open for people to make right now because of the Lad McConkey enthusiasm. Brian Thomas Jr. is an interesting one because that could end up being the Calvin Ridley role, and he ends up exceeding our expectations. But for me, like Zay Flowers is super tilting for a lot of dynasty managers, maybe a little more so than a guy with his pedigree, draft capital-wise, in a plus offense should be. But there's a lot of good wide receivers out there, and let's keep this one going at the wide receiver spot. Let's talk about Jordan Addison because you talk about off-the-field incidents. You talk about a guy who performed well as a rookie and a guy who has NFL draft capital. Jordan Addison is a guy where we haven't heard anything about a suspension yet, and he's just sitting there. His redraft ADP has dropped significantly because of fears of the Minnesota offense. But last time you were on, we also talked about maybe J.J. McCarthy potentially performing a little bit better than some anticipating. Your thoughts on Jordan Addison? this year and in Dynasty.
Yeah, Jordan Addison was someone who he had a strong rookie season. I mean, he's someone who posted 14 plus points per game while having a very strong rookie prospect profile. So he's someone who you just like in general. The issue that I had with Jordan Addison is that when we look at his production, he benefited from Kirk Cousins a lot. His splits with Kirk Cousins versus not Kirk Cousins was pretty drastic. And he's someone who had a pretty high touchdown percentage, which doesn't always hold up, especially someone of his size in terms of touchdown expectation. Now, Jordan Addison is still a fine asset, but he was someone who was being valued wide receiver 20, sometimes higher. And just like we talked about with Zay Flowers, I'm not sure that wide receiver 1 upside is truly there, at least going into year 2 with the situation that he has now with either a rookie quarterback or Sam Darnold. So it's not a good situation. His redraft doesn't look great, but with the off the field issues, he's someone who dropped in price pretty dramatically. And he's someone who you're now more comfortable adding to your dynasty rosters at his current value. And when we look at Jordan Addison and being an elite plus prospect, posting 14 plus point per game, 77% of the players to do that did post wide receiver 1 seasons. So I'm not saying Jordan Addison can. I'm saying the immediate future doesn't hold high upside. And to have a guy in that wide receiver 15 to 20 range spending that value, you basically don't want a waste year where you're just looking at pretty non-impactful production.
Yeah, this one has gone kind of back and forth, and I've been more bullish on Addison than most for this year specifically and for moving forward. The guy was a very, very strong prospect coming out, a first-round pick, and then overperformed. So we've already seen it. And the whole notion of the touchdowns are going to regress, I get that. But at the end of the day, this is a player where I think this is a window where we can try to make little moves and see if people want to pivot off of Jordan Addison, because with Addison, I've already seen it. I also, Minnesota, I trust the play calling. I trust the fact that they're trying to get better at the quarterback position. And this is also a coaching staff that was able to get quarterback production out of Josh Dobbs and yardage-wise out of Nick Mullins. So for me, Jordan Addison's a guy where I'm not sure if he's going to gain value this month, but I do think he'll gain slight value this month if it looks like there's not going to be a suspension, which that's sort of where it's trending to be. You also have TJ Hawkinson missing the start of the season. Not sure how many games that's going to be. It sounds like they're a little bit more optimistic on Hawkinson than certainly some managers this summer were giving credits. I know we talked about Hawkinson potentially missing like a half a year. That looks wrong. I think Hawkinson maybe missing a month sounds about right, and maybe less. So Addison does have an opportunity with a consolidated target share to get off to a fast start. We'll see, though. It's definitely a very polarizing player and not a whole lot of buzz on him right now like some of these players. But one guy there is a exceptional amount of buzz. It's it's Chase Brown. Chase Brown's a guy who steamed way up this summer. This is a guy where the media reports have said he's running with the ones all the time. Another report today that Zach Moss was listed as the starting running back, but I don't put a whole lot into that because we talk about receptions being a big driver of fantasy production, and Joe Burrow showed a habit of targeting his running backs out of the backfield, whether it's Joe Mixon, whether it's Samaje Perine. It was like 120 plus targets to those two guys alone 2 seasons ago when Burrow was healthy. Chase Brown, 4.4 speed. Draft capital is not there, Ian, but he's going up against a 26-year-old who's never really done a whole lot. Your thoughts on Chase Brown this year being an ADP beater, and does he have the ability to gain a lot of dynasty value this year, or is he more of a guy you look at as he's a one-year wonder type for us in dynasty?
Yeah, someone that I'm not too intrigued in. And I'm never going to say I'm fully out on a running back, as we discussed, especially one going into year 2. But he's someone who didn't have great peripherals going into his second year. And if Joe Mixon was there, obviously, we wouldn't probably be having this conversation. But he also didn't have a great prospect profile. Draft capital aside, a fifth-year senior, didn't really produce, especially as a receiver, until his senior year, where he started putting up fine target shares out of the backfield. So Chase Brown is someone who don't love the profile. It's a fine situation. You hope that he becomes a starter. But with Chase Brown, there's a couple hurdles you have to get over. You have to hope that he is a better player than he has been in his past. And you have to hope that the opportunity is also there. So you're hoping on a couple things, and that's fine for any running back. Like we'll talk about the Vidals that we like. We'll talk about, the Audric Estimes. Like there are plenty of players like that we'll talk about that we like. And if Chase Brown was valued the same as them, we would be talking about that. But Chase Brown is not. Chase Brown is vaulting up his values to someone who we just talked about in Sharp is getting close to guys like Alvin Kamara, Blake Corum, even Tony Pollard. So, and ahead of guys like James Conner, who we expect to have production in an improved offense. So he's someone now where, yes, there is intrigue. I get it. And he's a running back who could have opportunity, but there's a lot of hoping in there for what's turned out to be quite a healthy amount of value attached.
So I think I'll butt heads a little bit with you on this because I think that they're more comfortable with Chase Brown based on what they did this offseason, where they didn't draft a running back and they signed Zach Moss when there was a really large market of veterans who've had a lot of fantasy success. I think they viewed Zach Moss as what he is, a guy who can absorb some volume. But I think in terms of the pass catching, they have shown a little bit of faith in Chase Brown, who the sample size was really small last year, but on a per touch basis, he showed explosiveness. He had the second highest miles per hour of any player in the NFL last year on that one catch and run, which is like the highlight that you see like 1,000 times for Chase Brown. But I'll be a little bit more optimistic on you. I've actually kicked the tires on trading for him on a couple of dynasty teams just to up my exposure to Chase Brown in case he does have this really big increase in production this year, which I think he could. Let's keep this going. Let's actually stick to the running back position. We talked about Will Levis. We talked about Brian Callahan, the head coach. Let's talk about the one Tennessee Titans offensive skill position player besides Treylon Burks, who's not like old, and it's Tyjae Spears. Last year at 50 receptions. This is a guy where, Ian, we had a window of time where we thought that this guy would be explode in ADP before they signed Tony Pollard. Tyjae Spears was like running back 18 on Underdog. Interesting player in Dynasty. He's pretty much a solid value right now in startup ADP. The buzz out of camp right now is they seem happy with both backs. This is not one where they're just singing the praise. It's not like the Seattle situation where you're hearing all this Ken Walker. You hear about both players and sort of their comfort level with them. Where are you at on Tyjae?
I'm intrigued with Tyjae. There's a few reasons why, and it's he has a fine prospect profile who's drafted before day 3, so they have put some draft capital into him. And then you look at what he did even alongside Derrick Henry in limited reps as a receiver out of the backfield. A 14.1% target share for a non-full-time running back is very good and very intriguing. That's something that should get you excited no matter the offense. And then we're talking about an offense with Will Levis where we're expecting an uptick in passing volume. So even if he's not taking a bulk of the carries, and we still expect growth from the limited carry percentage that he had last year, being 22.5%, even if Pollard ends up as the main rushing back out of the backfield, he's someone who produced at a very high level as a receiver, will be on the field more, and most likely is doing it in an offense that has an uptick in passing volume. So Tyjae Spears, doesn't have the safest floor. He's not going to be your favorite running back, not someone that you're going to put all the eggs in your basket into this one guy. But I'm very intrigued with Tyjae Spears. I think his ADP is fine. But yes, there is some concerns given that, he has had the injuries. He's someone who hasn't posted a high carry percentage, even though he's been alongside Derrick Henry. But him as a receiver in this offense is enough alone to get me intrigued.
Yeah, for me, it's just do we believe in a Tony Pollard bounce back? Tony Pollard, a little bit older. I think that the market adjusted to the fact that they paid him and they brought him in. And there was other teams as well. But Tony Pollard last year certainly took a big step back. Now, was that because of the injury? Probably. And I think Tony Pollard's also pretty much a fine target if you're in best ball in redraft. But anytime we see a back take a step back, we have to keep an extra eye on that. And with Tyjae Spears, if this offense becomes very, very pass happy, and this offense is in negative game situations where they're trailing, and we have an opportunity to see Tyjae Spears sort of eat garbage, like 50 receptions as a rookie. And I bring that number up a lot. It's not just a raw counting stat. When we see that sort of receiving ability out of players in year one of their career, it's often followed up by strong seasons down the line. And it's usually something that sticks with a player. Running backs who catch passes, offensive coordinators scheme things for them because it takes a lot of pressure off of a young quarterback like Will Levis. And I think we both can agree that Tyjae Spears last year looked way more explosive than Tony Pollard last year. Does Tony Pollard regain that explosiveness? Maybe. But I think Tyjae Spears is the kind of guy where he's cheaper. And in Dynasty, I get a little bit of a discount because of Tony Pollard being there. So Tyjae's been a guy where on rosters that I have him, I'm keeping him. And if somebody wants to trade me Tyjae Spears for and get 80 cents on the dollar, I'm doing that. Let's quickly talk about two other wide receivers here before we get to the final one. Tank Dell. Week one of training camp, it was a lot of buzz on Stephon Diggs. Nico Collins, of course, had the big contract this offseason. And Nico Collins finished as a wide receiver 1 last year. Tank Dell's sort of chilling out in the weeds right now, Ian. This is the number 3 wide receiver drafted on Houston right now. And its startup value, he's gone down a little bit. He's not a guy where if he would have never gotten hurt last year, I believe he would have gone a round earlier than where we're seeing him curtain dynasty startup values. Where you're at on Tank Dell, is this a buy the dip, buy the discount, or is this a you're a little bit apprehensive about year 2?
No, I'm definitely pretty high on Tank Dell. It definitely is not awesome for his sake that Stephon Diggs came to this offense, but he's still attached to CJ Stroud long term. It's an offense where we can see somebody in any of the wide receivers be a wide receiver 1 while still supporting the other 2 in a CJ Stroud offense that has room for an uptick in passing volume. And when you look at Tank Dell, what you said perfectly was before he got injured. If he didn't get injured, people are likely looking at him differently because before he got injured, he was posting 16 plus points per game. The only rookie wide receivers to do that are Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Odell Beckham Jr., Mike Evans, Michael Thomas, and Puka Nacua. That's no matter your situation, no matter your pre-prospect profile, that is an awesome bucket to be a part of. And that's from a production standpoint. So he is someone who I am intrigued with. I'm a little less excited for him with the fact that Stephon Diggs comes in immediately, but he's still someone I'm going to be higher on right now than the dynasty consensus.
Yeah, and I'm with you. I'm higher on him in Dynasty than some. And then in redraft, I look at it as this could be an annoying wide receiver room. I think the overall stats are going to be great, but all 3 players are going to have their spike weeks. But with Tank Dell, I'm able to get him as the 3rd wide receiver drafted. It's a guy who has a connection with CJ Stroud. Tank Dell, you brought up the points per game last year. I've drafted him a few times this year, and he's a guy where I've drafted him in a lot in best ball. I think Tank Dell, if healthy, is going to have his spike weeks. He's a player that I believe in long term. And he's a player that is attached to one of the best dynasty quarterbacks there is in CJ Stroud. We also don't know how long the window for Stephon Diggs is. This seems like this could be a 3-year window. This could also be a 1-year window. We don't quite know. 2 years would be my bet. But again, these guys, once they get past 30, it sometimes can go downhill quickly. Tank Dell also has the speed. Tank Dell is a guy where they showed versatility with him, Ian, where he could line up on the outside despite his size, and he's going to be able to bump into the slot. Noah Brown, those weeks with Noah Brown, if you ever have any questions on whether you should draft Houston Texans wide receivers, look at the Noah Brown spike weeks last year. They're all going to eat. Talk about another confusing wide receiver room. Let's talk about Green Bay. And this is one where every single day you're seeing people retweeting and commenting on the snaps, who's lining up with the first team offense at wide receiver spot specifically, because you have Romeo Doubs, Christian Watson, you have Dontavian Wicks, and you have Jaden Reed. Jaden Reed last year from week 10 on was giving you like wide receiver 10 overall numbers. He's also a guy that played like 50, 60% of snaps. So does Jaden Reed take the next step this year and become more of a not full-time player, but a guy who's bumping north of 70 snaps, 70% snap share a game? Or is he a guy where you worry he's a little bit more of a role player and a guy who's going to fail to sort of deliver on his current value?
He's someone that I like. he's someone who on a per route basis was quite good last year. Now, we already talked about the Green Bay offense and how there's wide range of outcomes all over the place. But Jayden Reed is someone who you can be a little more comfortable than others because he was someone who they drafted in the second round. He was a solid prospect, an upside prospect. And like when we combine that with what he did on a per route basis, we're talking about an upside prospect to post 24% plus target rate and 2+ yards per run. That's quite good. The other ones to do it: Odell, Demaryius Thomas, Percy Harvin, Chris Olave, and Drake London. So on a per route basis and being a solid prospect, while those are pretty lofty expectations and not his range of outcomes by any means, he has a high ceiling and likely the highest ceiling on the Green Bay offense. And with Jordan Love being a strong passer, he's someone who I would like taking him at his ADP, to be quite honest, with the fact that he has the highest upside within this offense.
Yeah, I think you nailed that. It's the highest upside within this offense. And even if you're wrong, even if we're wrong, and Jayden Reed is a guy where maybe he doesn't take a step forward, where he's being priced right now, Ian, it's lower than his final scoring numbers last year. And he's a guy where when Aaron Jones was gone, we saw the rushing attempts ramp up. Marshawn Lloyd has dealt with some injuries and is a little bit slower out the gate than I would have liked to see. Maybe we see Jayden Reed also used in this Swiss Army knife, sort of like a Debo light role again this year to put even more pressure on opposing defenses. But it's sort of this is like a disconnect between people that watch film and people that simply look at the final numbers. Because if you're watching film, like Jayden Reed did things that looked really special last year. And I think that the Green Bay Packers coaching staff are smart for the most part. And I think they're going to self-scout and realize to win games, to challenge Detroit in this division, and to challenge the NFC, we're going to need Jayden Reed to do a lot more than what he did last year. It really didn't do much in that playoff game. So for me, it's Jayden Reed is a guy I want exposure to. He's cheaper in redraft than anticipated, and in dynasty startups, you're getting him at a pretty solid value based on what we saw last year. Final guy we got to talk about. We would love positive buzz all month long. Jackson Smith-Njigba. Ian, your thoughts on him? I have a bet with Billy Muzio. Wide receiver 32.5 or better is my bet. Last year, I lost my JSN bet with Billy. I got to get my revenge this year, but it's a perfect storm. Ryan Grubb taking over in Seattle, all that success at the University of Washington, pass-happy offense, 36 points a game. They led the nation in passing yardage last year with Michael Penix behind center. And now you have JSN year 2, a chance to really bounce back. There's nothing but positive vibes right now in your neck of the woods in the Pacific Northwest about JSN, the coaching staff liking him. Where are you at on how he does this year and him as a dynasty asset?
He is someone that has a pretty wide range of outcomes. We're talking about someone who's a good prospect, but had a very down year. Even on a per route basis, he wasn't too great, which isn't good to see. Now, Jackson Smith-Njigba at wide receiver 25 is a bit rich for me. I don't think he's too far off from that. I have him roughly wide receiver 28, if I recall correctly. So he's right in that range, but someone that I'm below consensus on and really don't have many shares of. Not because I don't think it's possible for him to have a very good year next year and vault his ups or his value up a little bit. But it's the upside, even if he does hit, that is concerning to me. Because yes, we could talk about his average depth of target. And a lot of people want to say his 6.4 average depth of target was the fault of the last offensive coordinator in Seattle. And that it's the role that he had to be in because he was a rookie, wasn't doing, what we wanted him to do, and Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf had deeper down the field roles. Now, while his average depth of target likely increases and has to, if we really want to see, some high-end upside, unless you have Cooper Kupp, Amon-Ra St. Brown, 30% plus target share types, you can't survive very high-end upside with that level of average depth of target. And that's not something we expect from Njigba, even at his highest outcome. But the problem that I have with that argument is that if that's true, then what was the Ohio State offensive coordinator doing with him as well? Because his entire profile says that's kind of who he is. Even in his best year, his average depth of target was 9.3. The year before that was 7.8. So we've never seen Jackson Smith-Njigba in a pretty high leverage target role, even if he's earning quite a bit of targets. So with Jackson Smith-Njigba, his value can be fine. and he can have a solid year, but he's someone who I have a hard time seeing that wide receiver 1 level upside to really vault the upside that I want, taking him at wide receiver 25.
I think you have a good argument there on lacking like what we thought maybe this could be there's some crazy stuff, we're talking about like Cooper Kupp type comparisons, in his prospect profile by some. For me, this is a great time though for Jackson Smith and Jigba, because the rookie enthusiasm has pushed him down to a range where he's really, really affordable. And you see sort of the best ball effect that we get on Dynasty, but JSN, maybe he doesn't give us a top 10 wide receiver season. And I'm not going to bet on that, but I think JSN can give us a wide receiver 2 season, a guy who's continually in our lineups. And right now I'm paying wide receiver 40 type prices for him. I think that the threat of Tyler Lockett is going to be less so this year with him getting a year older and having a new coaching staff come in. I also think that DK Metcalf is what he is at this point, but DK Metcalf's a guy where we haven't seen him go north of wide receiver 20 in 3 straight seasons in PPR points per game. JSN has a chance to cut into those targets as well. For me, I'm going to also say that JSN, one thing that doesn't get discussed a lot is he was coming off of injury both at Ohio State and last year in the preseason. He had surgery last summer. So this is a guy where we're seeing a healthy JSN right now, and I think where that's going to shine on the field. So we're butting heads on a couple of these guys, but these are players we want to pay attention to this month. We're a little bit over a month away from opening game, NFL Thursday, and I think these second-year players are ones we really want to keep an eye on. Training camp is going to be an important one for a lot of these guys. Was sure a lot of fun talking about them. Ian, let everybody know once again where they can find your work.
You can find me over on Twitter at Dynasty_am, but most importantly, you can find me on my Patreon, where we have everything that you could possibly want to know about a player, prospect, or recruit, along with a few other things, all right there that'll eventually and pretty soon be all just on one general website. So thank you so much for having me on the Dynasty Life yet again, and looking forward to start hosting Futurecast with you.
Yeah, I'm stoked for that. Love this one. And I'm going to be at the Fantasy Football Expo. This is the last Dynasty Life of the week. Come up and say what's up at the Expo. I'm going to be there with Matt Kelly, the Podfather. Anand Nanduri, also from Player Profiler, is going to be there. Love to talk a little bit of Dynasty with you. And we'll be back next week on Dynasty Life. We'll see you then.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.